What if the greatest judgment about your life was already happening right now, quietly, inside your own mind, without anyone around you noticing? What if what you think about when you're alone, those thoughts you've never said out loud, were the very place where God watches the most, weighs the most, and decides the most? There is a discomfort that few admit, but many feel. That instant when the mind doesn't stop, when memories come back, when intentions get mixed up and you realize that not everything inside you is at peace. It is like a constant, repetitive echo that insists on returning, even when the day ends, and the silence of the night seems to reveal more than it hides. And as much as you try to control, organize, or ignore, there's something deeper going on. Something that cannot be disguised with external attitudes, because while the world sees actions, God sees thoughts. While people judge behaviors, God dives into intentions. I, the Lord, search the heart and test the thoughts. Jeremiah 17:10. That changes everything. This reveals that there is no safe hiding place within one's own mind. Every thought fed, every intention cultivated, every silent desire, everything is being observed with a precision that no human being would be able to achieve. And perhaps the most unsettling thing is to realize that many live a lifetime trying to look right on the outside, while on the inside they fight battles that they never really won. But there is something even deeper, almost invisible, that most have never noticed. A kind of hidden key within Jesus' own words, something that seems simple at first glance, but which carries a power capable of completely transforming what happens inside you. It is not something new, but it has been forgotten. It is not far away, but it is rarely applied. And this is exactly what explains why so many people continue to be stuck in the same inner cycles, even though they seek God. For as he thought in his heart, so is he. Proverbs 23:7. There is a way out, but it doesn't start outside. It starts within. And what will be revealed here is not theory, it is not just knowledge, it is a real, deep, and accessible path. If you stay until the end, something within you will begin to align in a way that perhaps you have never experienced before. And that shift can begin as early as today, even tonight. On this path that we are starting together, you will begin to notice something that may never have been explained in this way, how God sees what no one sees, and how your thoughts may be bringing you closer or farther away from His presence without you realizing it. Each part will reveal living examples from the Bible where the heart was exposed, cared for and transformed, showing in practice how this also happens today. For the Word of God is alive and active, and is able to discern the thoughts and intents of the heart. Hebrews 4:12. As you continue, something inside you begins to awaken, as if these words are ringing exactly where you need it most. And there is something important in all this. God did not bring you here by chance. There is a purpose even at this moment. When you like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. You help this message reach people who are in need of exactly what you are listening to right now. And this is exactly where everything starts to get deeper, because the human heart is not just a place of feelings. It is the center where invisible decisions are made before any action appears. It is within it that thoughts gain strength, take root, and begin to shape the way you live, react, and stand before God. The Bible does not treat the heart as something symbolic or superficial, but as the true axis of the spiritual life, the place where everything is set quietly, away from people's eyes, but completely exposed before heaven. When God sent Samuel to choose the new king of Israel, everyone expected the choice to be based on appearance, posture, or strength. But at that moment, a truth was released that completely changes the way of understanding divine judgment. Man sees the outside, but the Lord the heart. 1 Samuel 16:7. This reveals something uncomfortable and at the same time liberating, because it shows that what you appear to have no greater weight than what you really carry inside. And maybe you've experienced it, moments when you did everything right on the outside, but inside there was conflict, doubt, divided intention. And it is exactly in this place that God looks. The heart can become a throne, where God rules and directs every thought, or it can become an abyss, where distorted ideas accumulate until it completely dominates the mind. And the most dangerous thing is that this happens silently, almost imperceptibly. Repeated thoughts begin to create internal pathways, and those paths become patterns, and those patterns come to control decisions without you realizing it. This is why many people do not understand why they continue to be stuck in the same cycles, even though they want to change, because they have not realized that the root is not in actions, but in thoughts that have never been confronted. Jesus made this even clearer when he said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Matthew 5:8. This is not about seeing with the eyes, but about perceiving, feeling, discerning God's presence in a real way. And here is a point that few understand. It is not God that hides. It is the heart that, when it is loaded with misaligned thoughts, loses its spiritual sensitivity. That is, the internal condition defines the level of connection. And there is something even more delicate in all this, which is the divided heart. The one who seeks God externally, but internally feeds thoughts contrary to what he says he believes. This creates an invisible rupture, a kind of spiritual blockage that prevents advancement. God does not reject the pursuit, but confronts division, because he does not relate to appearance. He responds to the truth that exists within you. Perhaps, as you hear this, you begin to realize that some things within you need to be adjusted, not at the surface, but at the root. And if that message is touching something deeper within your heart, don't ignore it. It may be that this is exactly the moment when God is trying to show you something that you have never seen in this way. If this made sense to you, write Amen in the comments, because sometimes a simple answer is the first step in a transformation that starts from within. And as this truth deepens, something begins to become impossible to ignore. Jesus didn't just come to correct behavior, he came to expose intentions. He took spiritual understanding to a level that no one was prepared to hear, because until then, people believed that it was enough to avoid visible error to be right before God. But when he began to teach, everything changed. He looked beyond actions and entered directly into the territory of thoughts, where everything really begins. When Jesus said, "Whoever looks at a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart," Matthew 5:28. He wasn't just extending a rule, he was revealing an eternal principle. Sin is not born in the act, it is born in the desire nurtured, in the thought aloud, in that which grows silently within the mind. This completely changes the way we see our own life, because it shows that it is not possible to hide anything from God simply by avoiding external attitudes. What you think, what you imagine, what you desire, all of this is already being considered. And perhaps there is a very strong point of confrontation here, because many have learned to control behavior, but have never learned to treat the origin. It's like cleaning the surface while the root remains diseased. And this is exactly what Jesus confronted in the religious of the time when he declared, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they are full of rapine and intemperance." Matthew 23:25. These words were not just a criticism, they were a direct warning. Spiritual appearance does not sustain a life before God. What God observes is not what you show, but what you feed. And this requires a much deeper transformation, because it is not just about doing the right thing, but about desiring the right. It is not just a matter of avoiding error, but of rejecting that which inside the mind tries to become error. And here's something that few understand. God doesn't just react to what you've done, but to what you've wanted to do and decided to cultivate or reject within yourself. This reveals human frailty because it shows that no one can, on their own, maintain completely pure thoughts all the time. But at the same time, it points to the need for something greater, a transformation that starts from the inside out. It's not about instant perfection, it's about spiritual awareness. It's about noticing what's going on inside of you and deciding what stays and what needs to be confronted. And maybe now, as you listen to this, some specific thoughts are coming to your mind, things that you have never talked about, but that you know are there, silent, present, and it is not by chance. It could be just God shedding light on something that needs to be addressed. If this word is awakening in you, this desire to align your inner self with God, write in the comments, "Speak, Lord, your servant hears." And leave your like on this video, because then this message can reach other people who also need this awakening. And it is at this point that David's story reveals something profoundly human and at the same time profoundly spiritual. Because unlike many, David was not called a man after God's own heart because he was perfect, but because he knew how to deal with what happened inside him. He made a mistake, and he made a serious mistake. But what happened after the mistake is what reveals the secret that many ignore to this day. When he was confronted by the prophet Nathan, David did not try to hide it. He did not try to justify. He did not try to soften the situation. He looked inside himself and recognized that the problem was not just what he did, but what he allowed to grow inside his heart, even before the action happened. And this is exactly where everything connects with what we are living now. Because often, the greatest danger is not in visible error, but in silent thoughts that are fed without confrontation. David understood this in a way that few do. Hence he cries out, "Create in me, O God, a clean heart, and renew in me a right spirit." Psalm 51:10. Notice that he doesn't just ask for forgiveness for what he did, he asks for transformation to what he is inside. He understood that if the interior was not treated, the cycle would continue. There is a very big difference between those who try to appear right and those who choose to be true before God. And David chose the truth, even when it exposed him completely. "Behold, you love the truth inwardly, and make me know wisdom in secret." Psalm 51:6. This reveals something powerful. God is not impressed by appearance, but moves before sincerity. When someone stops hiding and begins to expose their own soul before him, something begins to change in a real way. Maybe you've tried to hide certain thoughts, ignore certain intentions, or even pretend that some things inside you don't exist. But the truth is that what is not exposed cannot be cured. That which is hidden continues to grow in silence. And the most dangerous thing is that over time, this begins to shape decisions, behaviors, and even the way you see yourself spiritually. David shows us that God's judgment is not just about condemning, but also about restoring. There is a way back, but it starts with an open heart, without masks, without justifications, just truth. God responds to this kind of surrender. It transforms confessed thoughts, but allows hidden thoughts to become burdensome. And maybe now, in the silence of this moment, you are noticing something inside you that needs to be surrendered. Don't ignore it. This is the point where the transformation begins. If this truth is speaking to you personally, write in the comments, "God knows my heart." It may sound simple, but sometimes a single heartfelt sentence is the beginning of a change that reaches places no one else can touch. And when we look at Saul's life, the contrast with David begins to reveal a quiet warning that many ignore. Saul also started well, with humility, with a sense of dependence on God. But something changed along the way, not visibly at first, but within him. Small thoughts began to emerge, small distortions, small internal decisions that seemed insignificant, but were never confronted. And this is exactly how the deviation begins, not with great mistakes, but with thoughts that are allowed without resistance. Saul began to act out of fear of losing people's approval and a desire to maintain control, and this was silently shaping his mind. He still spoke as a leader, he still stood as a king, he still maintained the appearance of someone chosen by God, but inside, something had already become disconnected. And this is one of the most dangerous points of the spiritual life. When the appearance continues, but the presence is no longer there in the same way. When God gave Saul a clear command and he decided to adapt that command to his own logic, it wasn't just outward disobedience. It was the reflection of a heart that was no longer fully aligned. And then comes one of the strongest statements in Scripture. Rebellion is like the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is like idolatry. 1 Samuel 15:23. This shows that God was not only dealing with the act, but with the internal disposition that led to the act. The root was in the thought that decided not to obey completely. And perhaps here there is something that needs to be watched very carefully, because Saul did not see himself as someone rebellious. He believed that he was doing the best he could, that he was balancing things, that he was in control of the situation. But this is the subtlest deception, when the mind begins to justify what God has already made clear. The problem was not a lack of knowledge, it was internal resistance. And then comes a turning point, where what had already happened within him is finally declared outwardly. The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day. 1 Samuel 15:28. Before this sentence was even spoken, the kingdom had already been lost within Saul's heart. This shows that God's judgment does not wait for the outward manifestation to take place. It begins in what no one sees. Saul reveals the danger of living a spirituality based on appearance, while the interior is gradually distorted. Unconfronted thoughts become decisions, decisions become paths, and paths define destinies. And the scariest thing is that all this can happen without the person realizing it right away. Perhaps, as you hear this, you begin to reflect on some areas of your life where thoughts have been ignored, where small compromises have been made, where the truth has been softened to fit into a comfort zone. And it is exactly at this point that God calls for a real alignment, not external, but internal. If you are here so far, it is because this message did not arrive by chance. There is something being dealt with within you, something being revealed with precision. And at the end of this journey, we will live a deep moment of prayer, a real encounter with God to align thoughts, restore the heart, and renew its spiritual strength. Stay until the end, because that may be the moment that will mark a true change within you. And there is a type of thinking that many consider normal, even inevitable, but that carries a much greater spiritual weight than it seems: anxiety. It does not arrive making noise. It does not present itself as something destructive at first, but it takes up space, dominating the mind, creating scenarios, anticipating problems, generating constant restlessness. And the most delicate thing is that over time, the person begins to believe that this is part of life, without realizing that in fact, this thought pattern is directly affecting their connection with God. Jesus treated this very directly, because he knew that anxiety is not just a fleeting emotion, but a reflection of something deeper going on in the heart. When the mind does not stop, when thoughts revolve around fear, lack, uncertainty, this begins to shape the way a person sees their own reality. And without realizing it, trust in God is being replaced by a need for control, by a constant attempt to foresee and avoid everything. Do not be anxious about anything. Philippians 4:6. This is not just an orientation, it is an invitation to another level of spiritual life. Because anxiety, when fed, begins to distort the view of divine provision. The person starts to look at what is missing, at what can go wrong, at what has not yet happened, and fails to perceive God's care that is already present. And this creates a cycle where thoughts generate worry, worry weakens faith, and fragile faith feeds thoughts even more. But Jesus points to a completely different path when he says, "Seek first the kingdom of God." Matthew 6:33. This is not just an external priority, it is an internal alignment. It is choosing, even in the face of restless thoughts, to direct the mind to that which is eternal, to that which is true, to that which does not change. And here is something very profound. God does not ignore the fear that arises, but observes the decision to stay in it, even when the mind tries to take it elsewhere. Repeated thoughts become beliefs, and beliefs shape destinies. If the mind remains stuck in anxiety, the heart begins to turn away from the peace that God offers. But when someone decides to confront these thoughts, when they choose to trust, even without understanding everything, something begins to change from the inside out. It's not instantaneous, but it's real. It is a process where the mind is trained, aligned, renewed. Maybe you've noticed how certain thoughts repeat themselves throughout the day, as if they're trying to convince you of something all the time. And perhaps for the first time, you are understanding that this is not just emotional, it is spiritual. And it may be exactly here that God is calling you to a new position. If this message spoke directly to you, and you feel this desire to surrender your thoughts to God, write in the comments, "Lord, I receive your teachings." Make it an act of surrender. And leave your like, because then this message can reach other people who also need to find that peace that only God can give. And Pedro's story reveals something that happens to many more people than one imagines, because he lived, in a matter of moments, two extremes within the same mind. In an instant he received a direct revelation from God, something that came not from human logic, but from divine inspiration. When he declared that Jesus was the Christ, he was praised, recognized, affirmed, but soon after, without realizing it, his thoughts changed direction, and what seemed like care and concern turned into spiritual misalignment. When Jesus began to talk about what needed to happen, about suffering, surrender, and purpose, Peter reacted based on what made sense to him. It was logical, it was understandable, it was even well-intentioned. But it was just at that moment that Jesus answered firmly, "Get behind me, Satan, who does not understand the things that are of God, but the things that are of men." Mark 8:33. This reveals something profound and even disconcerting. Not every thought that feels right is aligned with God. Peter wasn't trying to do anything wrong. He was just thinking like a man, limited to his own understanding. And this is exactly where many get confused. Thoughts may seem good, they may seem rational, they may even seem right to human eyes, but yet they are completely outside of divine direction. This happens because there are different origins for what passes through the mind. Not everything comes from God, not everything comes from you alone, and discerning this is one of the most important parts of spiritual life. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts," Isaiah 55:8. This statement shows that there is a clear difference between what God thinks and what man naturally understands, and this difference requires vigilance. Because if the mind is not observed, if the thoughts are not filtered, one begins to act based on a logic that does not carry the complete truth. Peter shows us that it is possible to love God, to walk with Him, and yet, at certain times, to think in a misaligned way. This does not mean failure, but it reveals the need for constant attention. The mind cannot be left without direction because it is influenced all the time. And what defines the path is not only what arises, but what is accepted and maintained. Perhaps you have experienced this, moments when you made decisions based on what felt right, but then realized that something was not at peace within you. This restlessness is often a sign that the thought needs to be re-evaluated, aligned, submitted to something greater. God doesn't just see what you do, He discerns where it came from within you. And if this message is bringing clarity to something that you had never perceived in this way, this is already a sign that something is being adjusted within you now. If this word is touching your heart, don't ignore this moment. When you like, subscribe, and activate the bell, you help this message reach other people who also need this awakening. Be a part of it and allow this truth to continue spreading. And all of this brings us to an even more sensitive point, because it is not just about identifying wrong thoughts or correcting attitudes, but about understanding how the internal condition of the heart defines the level of experience with God. Jesus stated something that seems simple, but carries a depth that few truly live. Only the pure in heart will see God. This does not speak of perfection, but of alignment. It is not about never failing, but about consciously choosing what remains within you. Seeing God is not just a future promise, it is an experience that begins here, in the way you perceive, feel, and discern His presence in your daily life. And what many do not realize is that this perception is directly linked to the thoughts that are cultivated. When the mind is loaded with noise, distractions, divided intentions, spiritual sensitivity begins to diminish. Not because God has moved away, but because the heart has lost clarity. Above all things, guard your heart, for out of it are the sources of life. Proverbs 4:23. This advice is not just about emotional care, it is a spiritual direction. Guarding the heart is protecting that which enters, that which remains, and that which grows within you. Because every thought that finds space begins to influence how you see everything around you, including how you relate to God. And here there is something very practical but at the same time profound. Purity does not happen by chance. It is built. It's a result of daily, often silent choices where you decide what you feed and what you reject. Sometimes it's small thoughts that seem harmless, but when repeated, they start to create a distorted lens of reality. And this lens affects everything from simple decisions to the level of peace you feel. On the other hand, when someone begins to align their thoughts with the truth, even gradually, something begins to change. The mind becomes lighter, the heart more sensitive, and the presence of God more perceptible. Not because anything external has changed, but because the interior has been adjusted. And this adjustment is not instantaneous. It is a continuous process, a construction that happens every day. Perhaps you have felt moments when you seemed more connected to God, more sensitive, more at peace. And perhaps He also lived through phases in which this connection seemed distant, difficult to perceive. Often the difference between these moments is not in the circumstances, but in the thoughts that were dominating your mind at each stage. And now, as you listen to this, it may be that someone has come into your heart, someone who needs that peace, that clarity, that inner transformation. Maybe it's someone close, someone who is going through a silent struggle. If this happened, don't ignore it. Write this person's name in the comments and, in a simple way, present them before God. Because when you do that, you become part of something bigger, a chain of faith that reaches lives in real ways, even from a distance. And this is exactly where many get lost without realizing it, because they believe that everything they think comes from themselves, as if the mind were a single and reliable source. But the truth is that not every thought that arises deserves to be accepted. Some come as subtle suggestions, others as repetitive impulses, others as ideas that seem to make sense in the moment, but carry completely wrong directions. And that is why spiritual discernment becomes one of the most important skills in the life of those who want to walk in line with God. The mind is not just a place where thoughts happen, it is a field where decisions are made all the time. Each thought that comes to you carries an origin, an intention, and a consequence. Some come from God, bringing direction, peace and clarity. Others are born of human nature itself, carrying desires, fears, and limitations. And there are still those that arise from external influences, which try to confuse, divert, and weaken the faith. The problem is that without discernment, all of this gets mixed up, and the person begins to live reacting to thoughts that should never have been accepted. Bringing every mind captive to the obedience of Christ. 2 Corinthians 10:5. This shows that there is an active responsibility for what you allow to remain in your mind. It's not just about what comes up, but about what you decide to keep. Uncontrolled thoughts become paths, and paths define destinies. Therefore, discernment is not optional. It is essential. And how does this happen in practice? Start with attention. It starts with the ability to observe what you're thinking without automatically accepting it. It's as if you start to question, does this thought bring me closer or further away from God? Does this generate peace or restlessness? Is this aligned with truth or fear? This process may seem simple, but it is profoundly transformative because it changes the way you position yourself in front of your own mind. Examine everything, hold fast to good. 1 Thessalonians 5:21. This is a principle that, when applied, protects the heart in a powerful way. Not everything should be rejected, but not everything should be accepted. There is a filter that needs to be developed, a sensitivity that grows over time, as you draw closer to God and become more aware of what goes on inside of you. And here's something few realize. God doesn't just judge the thoughts that come in, but how you deal with them. There is a difference between a thought that arises and is rejected, and a thought that is nurtured and cultivated. This difference defines much more than it seems, because it reveals the direction of the heart. Perhaps now you are beginning to realize how many times you accepted thoughts without question, how many times you let ideas grow unfiltered, how many times you followed inner directions that seemed natural but were not aligned. And this awakening is already the beginning of a change, because from the moment you see, you can choose differently. Nothing happens by chance. This message may be exactly the answer you have been quietly seeking, that direction you needed to understand what is going on inside you. Stay until the end, because there is a moment prepared where all this will connect even more deeply, and you will not want to miss what God will still reveal to your heart. And after all this, a question begins to arise almost inevitably. If there are so many thoughts going through the mind, how do you recognize when it is God speaking? Because unlike what many imagine, God does not compete with noise. He doesn't force, he doesn't invade, he doesn't scream to be heard. Most of the time, he manifests silently, almost imperceptibly, as a thought that arises lightly, but that carries a different direction from everything around it. And that's exactly what happened to Elias. After experiencing intense moments, facing challenges and pressures, he reached a point of exhaustion where he expected a great response from God. And then came strong demonstrations, wind, earthquake, fire, but God was not in any of these, until in the silence, something happened. And after the fire, a still small voice. 1 Kings 19:12. This reveals a pattern that continues to this day. God speaks, but he speaks in a way that requires sensitivity, not just attention. The problem is that many are expecting something external, visible, unquestionable, while ignoring what is already happening within them. Small impressions, thoughts that arise bringing peace, direction, an impulse to do the right thing even when no one is watching. And because it seems too simple, many discard, doubt, or replace it with more intense, more urgent, more emotional thoughts. But there is a clear difference. The voice of God does not confuse, does not generate uncontrolled restlessness, does not push to hasty decisions. It directs, calms, aligns. And yet, It can be easily ignored because it competes with emotions, fears, external pressures, and even human logic itself. That is why the discernment that has been spoken of before connects directly here, because without it, the voice of God is lost in the midst of so many other voices. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. John 10:27. This shows that hearing God is not a rare event. It is a condition of relationship. He speaks, but he also observes who is willing to listen, and more than that, who is willing to follow what he has heard. Because it is not enough to recognize, it is necessary to respond. And here there is something very profound. God plants thoughts aligned with his will within the mind, but the decision to accept or reject remains a human one. And this decision carries spiritual weight, because often it is in these silent thoughts that important directions, necessary changes, deliverances that could happen, and even answers that were asked for in prayer are born. Ignoring these thoughts doesn't seem like a big deal at the moment, but it could mean missing out on something that never comes back the same way, and at the same time, welcoming these directions, even if small, can open paths that you never imagined traveling. Because the mind, once again, reveals itself as that place where everything begins, where God initiates movements that will only be understood later. And when you look at the story of Judas, what scares you most is not the final act of betrayal, but the silent path that led him there. Because Judas didn't start out as a traitor. He walked with Jesus, listened to life-changing teachings, witnessed miracles that many had never seen, was as close to the truth as few have been. But even so, something began to happen inside him, away from the eyes of others, in a place that no one could see. Judas's fall did not begin with the kiss that gave Jesus. It began much earlier, in thoughts that were fed without confrontation. Small concessions, small intentions, desires that seemed controllable, but that grew over time. And this is one of the most dangerous points of the spiritual life. When something starts small within the mind and is not treated, it does not remain small. The gospel reveals a moment that seems sudden, but which was actually the result of an internal process. Then Satan entered Judas. Luke 22:3. It didn't happen out of nowhere. It was the result of doors that were opened little by little, through thoughts that were not rejected. And here's a truth that many avoid facing. Recurring thoughts, when fed, create space for influences that go beyond the natural. Judas allowed something specific to grow within him, something that seemed ordinary, even justifiable on a certain level, but which became dominant. For the love of money is the root of all evil. 1 Timothy 6:10. It wasn't just about money. It was about the place it held in his heart. It was about how that thought began to shape his decisions, his priorities, his perception. And when something takes that place, it starts to influence everything around. The most impactful thing is to realize that Judas continued to walk with Jesus while all this was happening inside him. This shows that it is possible to be close to the truth externally, and at the same time to move away internally. And this is exactly why God does not only judge what is seen, but the entire process that happens within the heart. Every thought accepted, every intention cultivated, every desire fed. It's all part of the path that leads to a final decision. And perhaps the strongest point of this story is to understand that in many moments Judas had the opportunity to confront what was inside him, but he chose not to. And this silent choice was building something that at a certain point became greater than what he was willing to face. This brings a very direct and personal reflection, because it shows that no one suddenly reaches an extreme point. There is always a path, a process, a sequence of thoughts that have been accepted over time, and recognizing this is not to generate fear, but awareness. Because what is perceived can be treated, but what is ignored continues to grow. And if this word has come to you so clearly, perhaps it is not by chance. It could be God bringing light to something that needs to be watched more closely within you. If this touched your soul in any way, write in the comments, "I trust God." Sometimes a simple expression of faith is the first step in breaking a cycle and starting a new path. And after understanding that thoughts can make or break entire paths, a question arises that changes everything. Is it possible to transform what is already rooted within the mind? Because many carry old patterns, repetitive thoughts, beliefs formed over years that seem to be part of who they are. But the truth revealed in Scripture points to something greater than that, something that goes beyond simply identifying the problem, but that offers a real path of transformation. Paul brings an orientation that is not superficial, it is profound and practical at the same time. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Romans 12:2. This shows that true transformation doesn't just happen in emotional moments, quick decisions, or isolated experiences. It happens in a continuous process where the mind is adjusted, repositioned, aligned with the truth of God. And here is an essential point. Renewing the mind is not automatically erasing old thoughts, it is replacing them. It is recognizing that which is not aligned and intentionally beginning to insert new truths in its place. Because the mind is not empty, it will always be filled. And if there is no conscious positioning, it goes back to the old patterns, to what was already established. And be renewed in the spirit of your understanding. Ephesians 4:23. This reveals that change starts from the inside out, but requires active participation. It is not something that happens without awareness, without decision. It's a process where you begin to filter what comes in, confront what remains, and strengthen that which is aligned with God. And over time, something begins to happen almost imperceptibly. What once dominated loses strength, and what was difficult begins to become natural. The renewed mind becomes a different environment. Thoughts of fear begin to give way to trust. Thoughts of doubt begin to be replaced by faith. Confused thoughts begin to give way to clarity. And this does not happen overnight, but it happens in a real way for those who decide to remain in this process. And perhaps most importantly, God doesn't just observe thoughts. He offers the way to transform them. He does not point out the problem without offering a solution. On the contrary, he invites you to a relationship where this renewal happens constantly, where the mind ceases to be a field of conflict and becomes a place of direction, peace, and purpose. Maybe you've tried to change some things inside of yourself and felt like you couldn't, as if you're stuck in the same cycles. But what is being revealed here shows that there is a different path, a path that does not depend only on willpower, but on continued alignment with the truth. And this alignment starts with small decisions, small changes, small steps that over time build something completely new. If you are here, it is not by chance. There is something being worked on within you right now, something that can completely change the way you think, feel, and live. Do not leave this moment before you fully understand what is yet to be revealed, because there is something prepared for you that can transform not only your thoughts, but the entire direction of your life. And in the midst of all this, a truth emerges that brings hope, because not every thought is a risk. Some are the beginning of a miracle. The story of the woman of the flow of blood reveals exactly that, showing that what is born inside the mind can not only influence decisions, but activate something supernatural. Before any movement, before any touch, before any visible change, something happened inside her. A thought was formed, a quiet conviction began to grow, and that was what changed everything. For he said, "If I will only touch your garments, I will be healed." Mark 5:28. Notice that she didn't say this to others, she said it within herself. It was an internal dialogue, a silent construction, a decision that no one heard, but that God saw. And this reveals something powerful. God doesn't just observe thoughts to judge, He also recognizes thoughts of faith to respond to. While many around her might have thought of limitations, of impossibilities, of giving up, she chose to nurture a different way of thinking. And this thought was not isolated. It became a force that moved her, that made her cross the crowd, overcome barriers, ignore contrary voices. It all started within her. And this shows that the mind, when aligned with faith, becomes a channel of manifestation. And maybe here is something you have never realized in this way. There are thoughts that carry doubt, fear, insecurity, but there are also thoughts that carry faith, trust, and expectation in God. And these thoughts carry spiritual weight. They are not ignored. They are seen, considered, and often the starting point for what God is going to do. When that woman finally touched Jesus, the miracle did not begin at that moment. The touch was just the manifestation of something that had already begun within her. That is why Jesus declares, "Your faith has made you whole. Go in peace." Mark 5:34. He didn't say it was just touch, but faith. And this faith was first born as a thought, as an internal decision, as something invisible. This completely changes the way you see what happens inside you, because it shows that it is not only negative thoughts that need attention, but also those that need to be strengthened, those who point to God, who believe even without seeing, who insist even without guarantee. These thoughts build paths that go beyond the natural, and perhaps in this moment there is something inside you trying to arise, a thought of faith that you have almost ignored, a hope that seemed small, but that insists on remaining. Don't rule it out. That may be exactly where God is starting something, because in the midst of so many thoughts that pass through the mind, those who are aligned with trust in God have the power to completely transform the direction of life. And when you start to recognize that, everything changes, because you stop being just someone who reacts to what you think, and you become someone who chooses what you are going to feed. If hearing this, you feel that God has been good, even in the midst of struggles, and that something inside you is being awakened, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple word of faith is confirmation that something new has already begun to happen within you. And there is an even more delicate point in this inner journey, something that many prefer to avoid, ignore, or even hide from themselves. They are those thoughts that no one sees, that are never spoken, that are kept silent, as if they were unimportant. But the truth is that what remains hidden within the heart never stays neutral. On the contrary, it grows, strengthens, and begins to influence everything around without the person noticing it clearly. Achan's story reveals this in an intense way. At a time when God had given a clear direction to the people, Achan decided to keep something for himself, something that seemed small in the face of everything, something that could easily be hidden. But the problem was not only the hidden object, it was the thought that came before, the internal decision that said that it would have no consequences. And that's the most dangerous point, when the mind begins to justify what God has already made clear. Hath not Achan committed, and did not great wrath come upon all the congregation of Israel? Joshua 22:20. This shows that what is hidden inside does not only affect those who keep it, but can generate much greater consequences. Unconfronted thoughts do not remain isolated. They create deep roots, shape attitudes, and over time affect decisions that impact other areas of life. And perhaps the most misleading thing is that, at first, it seems that nothing happens. The person continues to live, following his routine, maintaining his appearance as if everything was normal. But inside, something begins to weigh down, a restlessness, a loss of peace, a sense of disconnection that is not easily explained. And this happens because what is hidden begins to occupy space, begins to interfere in the way a person relates to God. He that covereth his transgressions shall never prosper. Proverbs 28:13. This is not just a warning, it is a revelation of how the spiritual process works. What is hidden is not resolved, it is just postponed. And while it remains hidden, it continues to grow. But when it is exposed, when it is brought to light, something begins to change. Because light not only reveals, it also transforms. God does not ignore what is hidden, but neither does he reject those who decide to expose. On the contrary, liberation begins at exactly that point, when one stops hiding and begins to surrender. It's not about condemnation, it's about healing. It's not about pointing out flaws, it's about restoring what was affected. And maybe now, in silence, you are remembering something that was stored, a thought, an intention, something that you never fully brought to light. And this is not by chance. It may be exactly God bringing to consciousness what needs to be dealt with so that you can move forward in a light and free way, because hidden thoughts never remain small. They grow, deepen, and shape paths. But when they are exposed, they lose strength and give space for something new to begin. This word is not for everyone. If you are here now, it is because there is something being revealed directly to your heart. Don't leave this moment without understanding what still needs to be adjusted within you, because what comes next can open your eyes in a way you never imagined. And when we come to Abraham's life, we are confronted with a reality that dismantles many misconceptions about faith, because contrary to what many think, Abraham did not live without contrary thoughts. He looked at himself, at his advanced age, at Sarah's body, at the time that had already passed, and everything around screamed that it was impossible. The logic was clear, evident, almost incontrovertible. But it is exactly in this scenario that something different happened within him. The Bible reveals a detail that completely changes the understanding of faith. And he did not grow weak in faith, nor did he look at his own body that was dead. Romans 4:19. This does not mean that he did not see reality, but that he decided not to hold on to it. Contrary thoughts did arise, but he did not allow these thoughts to become the basis of his decisions. And here is one of the greatest spiritual secrets. Faith is not the absence of doubt, it is the choice not to submit to it. Abraham could have entertained every thought of impossibility. He could have built up internal arguments. He could have quietly given up even before any outward manifestation. But he did the opposite. He chose to believe what God said, even when everything inside and outside of him seemed to contradict that promise. This reveals that God doesn't just watch what you feel, but what you choose to do with what you feel. For we walk by faith and not by sight. 2 Corinthians 5:7. This statement gains much greater weight when we understand that sight does not refer only to what the eyes see, but also to what the mind interprets. Often, thoughts are built based on what seems logical, what is visible, what has already been experienced. But faith breaks this pattern because it is not limited to what is natural. And perhaps here is something that needs to be understood in depth. God does not reject those who face thoughts of doubt, but honors those who decide not to remain in them. There is a difference between being visited by a thought and making that thought a place of permanence. Abraham was visited by reality, but he chose to abide in the promise. This shows that God's judgment is not based only on what goes through your mind, but on the response you give to those thoughts. When someone decides to trust, even without fully understanding, something begins to align in the spiritual world. It is not immediate to human eyes, but it is real before God. And as you look at this story, it's clear that the mind can try to limit what God has already released. Thoughts can try to reduce promises. They can try to adjust the impossible to fit what is comfortable. But when someone chooses not to surrender to it, they begin to experience something that goes beyond logic. Abraham did not see the promise fulfilled because he never had contrary thoughts. He saw it because he decided not to bow to them. And this decision, silent, internal, invisible to many, was exactly what God considered, what God honored, what God answered. And there is a reality that everyone faces, even if few can explain it clearly, a constant battle going on inside the mind. It is not something visible, it is not something that other people can easily perceive, but it is a daily confrontation between two paths, two inclinations, two voices that compete for space within the human heart. Paul describes it bluntly, "For the flesh lusts against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh." Galatians 5:17. This is not symbolic, it is real. It is a silent war that takes place in thoughts, in internal decisions, in what you choose to feed or reject. The flesh here does not speak only of evident desires, but of everything that is born of human nature without alignment with God. They are impulsive thoughts, automatic reactions, desires that seem natural, but that, when followed, take away from what God wants. On the other hand, spirit directs to something different, something that is not always immediate or comfortable, but that carries peace, clarity, and purpose. And the most important thing is to understand that this battle doesn't just happen in big or decisive moments. It happens in the details of everyday life. In thoughts that arise without warning, in small choices, in decisions that seem simple, but that build a direction over time. Because each accepted thought strengthens one of these voices, and over time, what is fed the most begins to dominate. For the mind of the flesh is death, but the mind of the Spirit is life and peace. Romans 8:6. This statement shows that it is not just about right or wrong, but about consequence. Carnal thoughts may seem satisfying at the moment, they may seem easier, faster, more natural, but the result of them is emptiness, disconnection, loss of spiritual sensitivity. Thoughts aligned with the Spirit, on the other hand, produce something different even when they require more effort at first. They generate life, peace, and a sense of direction that is not dependent on circumstances. And here's something that needs to be faced with sincerity. God watches what voice is dominating your mind. Not only what appears, but what remains. Not just what you feel, but what you decide to follow. Because this choice defines much more than isolated moments. It defines spiritual destiny. Perhaps you have felt this conflict. Moments when one part of you wanted to follow one path, while another part pointed to something different. This tension is not a sign of failure, it is a sign that there is a battle going on. And the victory is not in never facing it, but in deciding over and over again which voice you're going to strengthen. Because in the end, the mind becomes what it feeds the most. And this construction is silent, but extremely powerful. And if this message is bringing clarity about something you have been living inside, perhaps it is time to allow more people to also have access to this truth. There are many lives facing this same battle without understanding what is happening. When you interact with this message, like subscribe and activate the bell, you help to bring this light to those who need it. And so, that which began within you can reach many other hearts. And when we look at Daniel, we find an example that goes beyond words, because he lived exactly what many face today. Constant pressure to adapt, to give in, to adjust his thoughts to the environment around him. He was taken to a place where everything was different, where the values were different, where the influence was strong and continuous. And yet, something inside him remained unshaken. It was not just an external decision, it was an internal, silent, firm choice. Daniel settled in his heart not to defile himself, Daniel 1:8. Before any attitude, before any visible refusal, there was a definition within his mind. He decided internally that he would not allow that environment to shape his thoughts, his values, his identity. And this reveals something very powerful. True resistance begins within, long before any action is seen. Daniel had no control over his environment, but he did have control over what allowed him to stay inside. And that's exactly what many forget. It is not always possible to change what is around, but it is always possible to watch what is inside. Thoughts are influenced by everything that surrounds a person, but they don't have to be dominated by it. There is a choice, a position, a discipline that can be developed. And this discipline is not rigid or heavy, it is intentional. It is to decide over and over again what will be accepted and what will be rejected. It is noticing when something begins to distort the truth and stopping this process before it takes hold. Daniel did this quietly, not needing to prove anything to anyone, but God saw it, and that makes all the difference. Thou shalt keep in peace him whose mind is set upon thee. Isaiah 26:3. This promise connects directly with Daniel's stance. In the midst of an environment that could generate confusion, pressure, and fear, he remained at peace. Not because the circumstances were favorable, but because his mind was aligned with God. Peace did not come from outside, it came from inner firmness. And here is a very deep key. The disciplined mind becomes a territory where God reigns with authority. When thoughts are stored, filtered, and aligned, the heart is strengthened, the identity remains firm, and decisions begin to reflect something that does not depend on the environment, but on the presence of God. Daniel not only resisted, he prospered spiritually in a place where many would have been lost. And this did not happen by chance. It was a result of a constant decision not to allow contrary thoughts to become part of who he was. And this shows that even in the midst of pressure, there is a path of steadfastness, a path where the mind remains aligned, protected, and directed by something greater. And there is a tool that many know, but few use with the depth necessary to really transform the mind: the Word of God. Not as something just for occasional reading or momentary inspiration, but as a living instrument, capable of reconfiguring thoughts that have been formed over the years. Because the mind does not change only with effort, it changes when the truth takes the place of what was once a lie, doubt, or distortion. Jesus stated something that reveals this strength in a straightforward way. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. John 17:17. This shows that transformation does not happen just by trying to think differently, but by constantly exposing oneself to what is true. The word not only informs, it confronts, corrects, aligns, and over time begins to replace old patterns with a new way of looking at life. And maybe you've noticed it at some point, when a specific word brought clarity in the midst of confusion, when a verse seemed to answer exactly what you were experiencing. This is no coincidence. It is the effect of truth entering a place where there was uncertainty before. And the more that happens, the more the mind starts to adjust. I have kept your word in my heart, that I may not sin against you. Psalms 119:11. This reveals an essential principle. What you keep inside shapes your decisions. It's not just about reading, it's about internalizing. It is allowing the word to become part of the thought, part of the way of reacting, part of the way of interpreting situations. And when that happens, something starts to change consistently. Thoughts that previously led to error begin to be interrupted. Ideas that once seemed normal are now being questioned, and a new sensitivity develops where the mind begins to recognize what is aligned and what is not. This does not happen automatically, but it is inevitable for those who remain exposed to the truth. And here is something that needs to be clearly understood. God doesn't just observe thoughts. He also observes how much you value the truth that can transform them, because there is a difference between knowing the word and allowing it to mold the inside. Many know, few apply. Many listen, few keep it. The mind that feeds on the word is strengthened. He becomes less vulnerable to external influences, less unstable in the face of circumstances, more firm in the face of challenges. And this does not mean the absence of difficulties, but the presence of leadership. It's knowing where to look, even when everything around seems confusing. And perhaps at this moment you are realizing how much what you have been feeding in your mind has directly influenced your life. And this is not a burden, it is an opportunity. Because what begins to be replaced today can generate completely different results tomorrow. If this message is bringing answers you needed, don't let it pass as something common. Write in the comments, "God takes care of me." Sometimes, stating a truth is the first step in allowing it to begin to govern your thoughts in a real way. And when observing Nehemiah's trajectory, it is evident how the focused mind can become a powerful protection against everything that tries to divert the purpose. He wasn't just rebuilding physical walls. He was sustaining a spiritual mission that required more than strength. It required inner clarity. Because as he advanced, there were voices around him, invitations, distractions, constant attempts to interrupt what God had placed in his heart. And the most interesting thing is that these distractions did not come in an obvious way. They often seemed like opportunities, conversations, proposals that could easily take his focus away without him noticing it right away. But Nehemiah had something very clear inside him. He knew what he was doing and why he was doing it, and that made all the difference. "I am doing a great work so that I cannot go down." Nehemiah 6:3. This was not just an external response. It was the reflection of a firm internal decision. Because before he refused externally, he had already decided internally that he would not allow anything to divert his mind from the purpose. And this reveals something very important. Distractions don't start outside. They start when they find space inside the mind. When thought is divided, when attention is dispersed, when focus is weakened, the path becomes vulnerable. Nehemiah faced opposition, criticism, threats, and attempts at intimidation, but none of it was able to stop what he was doing, because his mind was aligned with what God had entrusted to him. And this shows that true strengthening is not only in favorable circumstances, but in the clarity of purpose that governs thoughts. Be steadfast and steadfast, always abounding in the work of the Lord. 1 Corinthians 15:58. This orientation connects directly with this posture. Being firm is not just resisting externally, it is staying internally aligned, even when everything around you tries to pull you down another path. It is to keep the mind directed, even when contrary voices arise. And perhaps here there is a very practical key. What occupies your mind defines the level of focus you have. When thoughts are divided, purpose weakens. When the mind wanders, decisions begin to lose clarity. But when there is internal alignment, when the thought is directed, something is strengthened consistently. Nehemiah did not allow what was outside to control what was inside. And this made him remain unshaken, even in the midst of pressure, because when the mind is aligned with the purpose, external attacks lose strength, distractions lose space, and the path remains firm. Maybe you're living in a time where many things are trying to steal your attention, divert your focus, or generate doubts about what you know you need to do. And that's exactly where this message becomes personal, because it shows that the answer is not just in changing what's around, but in strengthening what's inside. What you hear now may be exactly what God is using to further align your heart and mind with what really matters. But this only makes sense for those who decide to continue. Stay until the end, because there is something that can completely change the way you see and respond to what is happening inside you. And when we come to the story of Job, We enter an even deeper level of this journey, because here we are not only talking about thoughts that arise in everyday life, but about a mind being tested in the midst of the most intense suffering. Job lost everything in a span of time that no human being is prepared to face. And along with the external losses came an internal avalanche of thoughts, pain, confusion, unanswered questions, feelings that could easily lead you to break with God. And it is exactly at this point that something extraordinary happens. The Bible states, "In all this Job did not sin, nor did he fault any fault to God." Job 1:22. This does not mean that he did not feel, that he did not question, or that there was no conflict within him. On the contrary, it shows that even in the midst of internal chaos, he chose not to allow these thoughts to dominate his standing before God. Because there is a very big difference between feeling and surrendering. Job felt deeply, but he did not give in to the thoughts that might drive him away, and this reveals something powerful. God allows the mind to be tested not to destroy, but to reveal what is really rooted in the heart. In times of peace, it's easy to keep thoughts aligned. But it is in pain that the true inner condition manifests itself, and perhaps here is one of the greatest truths of this journey. Fidelity is not measured when everything is fine, but when everything seems to fall apart. It is at this moment that thoughts are tested, that faith is confronted, that the mind is pushed to the limit, and what remains reveals who the person really is before God. Though he kill me, yet will I hope in him. Job 13:15. This statement was not born in a moment of tranquility, it was born in the midst of pain. And that changes everything, because it shows that true faith does not depend on favorable circumstances, but on an internal decision that remains, even when there are no clear answers. Job could have gone another way. He had opportunities. He had voices around suggesting giving up. He had thoughts that could lead him to abandon everything. But he chose to stay. And this choice was not visible to many, but it was completely clear before God. And this reveals something that needs to be understood in depth. God watches how you stand when your mind is pressed, not just what you do, but what you hold up inside when everything tries to destabilize you. Because it is in this place that faith ceases to be theory and becomes real. The mind that remains steadfast in God, even when all seems lost, becomes a living testimony, not only for others, but before God himself. It is a silent proof that trust is not based on what one sees, but on who he is. And maybe you're living in a time where your thoughts are being tested, where questions arise, where emotions mix and everything seems uncertain. And if this is happening, it may be exactly where something deeper is being formed within you. Because it is in this environment that faith ceases to be superficial and begins to become unshakable. And when Isaiah had that vision of the throne of God, something happened that completely changes the way we understand divine judgment. He was not confronted by something he did externally. There was no list of visible errors being presented before him. What happened was much deeper. In the face of God's holiness, he began to see what was within him with a clarity he had never had before. Alas, I'm lost, for I am a man of unclean lips. Isaiah 6:5. This reaction did not come from external accusation. It came from internal revelation. And this reveals a spiritual principle that few understand. The closer one gets to God, the more sensitive one becomes to what needs to be transformed. God's presence not only comforts, it also exposes, not to condemn, but to reveal what was hidden until then. Thoughts that once seemed normal start to bother you. Intentions that were previously ignored begin to weigh you down. And something inside the person begins to awaken to a deeper reality. Isaiah did not come out of that experience the same way he entered, because he saw himself in the light of God's holiness. and that changes everything. Because while human beings compare themselves with others, many things seem acceptable. But when the reference becomes the presence of God, what is misaligned becomes evident, and this process, although uncomfortable, is necessary. But there is something powerful at this moment. God does not only reveal, he purifies. Behold, this hath touched thy lips, and your iniquity is taken away. Isaiah 6:7. This shows that God's intention was never just to expose, but to transform. It touches exactly where it needs to be treated, and when one is willing to do so, a new spiritual condition begins to be formed. And perhaps this is one of the greatest secrets of this journey, not to run away when God reveals something within you, but to allow him to deal with it. Because what is ignored continues, but what is delivered can be transformed. And this process does not happen just once, it is continuous. As one gets closer to God, more areas are illuminated, more adjustments are made, more alignment happens. And this is not a sign of distancing, it is exactly the opposite. It is a sign of closeness, because God only reveals what he wants to transform. And the more one allows this process, the freer one becomes, the lighter one becomes, the more aligned one becomes with what God desires. Perhaps at this moment you are noticing something within you that did not seem so clear before, something that is now being exposed in a different way, and this is not by chance. It could be just God inviting you to a deeper level of transformation, not superficial, but real. Before we move on, if there's something that has come to your heart right now, something you feel needs to be surrendered or transformed, write it in the comments as a prayer request. Put before God what is inside you, because when there is unity in faith, something powerful happens, and what begins as a simple cry can become the beginning of a profound change. And as we look at Esther's story, we are taken to a time where the greatest battlefield was not around her, but within her. Everything seemed already defined externally, a real threat, a decree impossible to ignore, a scenario that put lives at risk. But what really needed to be decided was not outside, it was in the thoughts she would feed at that moment. Fear or courage, retreat or obedience, silence or positioning. When Mordecai sends the message that crosses her heart, something is activated in a profound way, and who knows if for such a time as this you have come to this kingdom. Esther 4:14. This was not just a question, it was a direct confrontation with what was inside her. Because until then, Esther could justify her position, protect her own life, avoid risk. All this seemed logical, understandable, even prudent. But there was a greater calling, something that required more than logic. It required internal decision, and it is exactly at this point that God's judgment manifests itself silently, observing what happens within the heart before any external action. Esther had to deal with thoughts of insecurity, with the real fear of the consequences, with the doubt about what would happen if she took a step further. And this reveals something very important. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision not to submit to it. Because fearful thoughts have a very great power to paralyze. They present scenarios, amplify risks, create justifications for not acting. And if they are not confronted, they can prevent destinies from being fulfilled. But when someone decides to face these thoughts, something begins to line up in a powerful way. If I perish, I perish. Esther 4:16. This sentence was not just an external statement. It was the result of an internal decision already made. Before acting, Esther had already won the battle within the mind. She chose to obey, even without guarantees, even without control over the outcome. And that changes everything because it shows that God doesn't just watch what you do, but the moment when you decide, within yourself, to trust above fear. And the impact of this decision was not only personal, it was collective. An inner choice released a transformation that reached many lifetimes. This shows that what happens inside you is never isolated. Thoughts aligned with God's purpose have the power to generate effects that go far beyond what you can see at the moment. Perhaps you are facing something that requires a decision, something that has generated internal conflict, divided thoughts, fear of what may happen if you move forward. And this is exactly the point where everything is defined, because what you decide to feed now will determine the path that will be followed. Esther shows us that courage begins in the silence of the mind, in that place where no one sees, but where everything is decided. And when this decision is made, even if with fear, even with uncertainty, it opens space for something bigger to happen. Because God responds not only to visible actions, but to the inner willingness to obey, even when the path is not entirely clear. And when this young man approaches Jesus, everything seems perfect at first glance. He speaks correctly, shows spiritual interest, claims to obey the commandments from an early age. To human eyes, he was exactly the kind of person that many would consider ready-made, prepared, an example of life. But Jesus does not respond only to what is said or shown. It goes straight to the point that no one else can see, the center of the heart. Go, sell everything you have, and follow me. Mark 10:21. This was not just an instruction, it was a revelation. Jesus exposed what was hidden, what occupied the most important place within that young man. Because the problem was not the wealth itself, but the attachment it generated, the space it occupied in thoughts, the value it had within it. And here is something that needs to be understood very clearly. God does not compete with that which dominates the heart, he reveals. He brings to light that which is occupying the place that should be his, and often this is not something visible to others. It can be something silent, internal, something that the person himself has not yet fully perceived. The rich young ruler was not prepared for that revelation. He sought confirmation, but found confrontation. He wanted to know what was still missing, but he didn't expect the answer to be linked to what he valued most. And that's exactly how God acts. He doesn't point out random areas. He touches directly on that which defines the direction of life. How hard it is for those who have riches to enter into the kingdom of God. Mark 10:23. This statement goes beyond money. It talks about anything that occupies the center of thoughts, that becomes an absolute priority, that begins to define choices, decisions, and paths. Because that which dominates the heart inevitably leads life. And the most impactful thing about this story is not only what Jesus said, but the young man's reaction. He left, sadly. This reveals that, at that moment, he could not let go of what was inside him. It wasn't a lack of knowledge, it wasn't a lack of opportunity, it was an internal decision, and that decision defined the path he followed. This shows that the greatest spiritual obstacle is not outside, it is inside. It is not in the circumstances, but in what is quietly valued. And God, in judging the thoughts of the heart, does not look only to right actions, but to that which governs the intentions. Perhaps you are realizing now that there are areas within you that have not yet been fully surrendered, things that take up space, that influence decisions, that somehow compete with the place that God desires to have. And this recognition is not to generate guilt, but to bring clarity. Because what is revealed can be adjusted. The young man had the opportunity to align his heart, but he chose to keep what was already rooted. And this choice, silent, defined everything. You have been reached by this message because there is a purpose in it. And if deep down you feel that God is showing you something that needs to be delivered, write in the comments, God chose me. Sometimes acknowledging this is the first step in putting God at the center of it all. And when observing the way Mary lived everything that was happening around her, a key emerges that many ignore in the spiritual process. Not every thought should be discarded quickly. At a time when everything was intense, unexpected, and even difficult to understand, Maria did not react impulsively, did not try to explain everything immediately, nor did she ignore what she did not understand. She did something different, something profound. She kept it. Mary kept all these things, meditating on them in her heart. Luke 2:19. This reveals an inner posture that goes beyond simply thinking. It is reflecting with intention. It is allowing what happened to be processed in the light of God. While many would let events pass without paying attention, she chose to stop, observe, and take it inside, allowing it to gain meaning over time. And here is something that completely changes the way we deal with thoughts. Not everything that crosses the mind needs to be rejected, but neither should everything be accepted without reflection. There is a place of balance where certain thoughts need to be brought before God, contemplated, analyzed, calmly, because it is in this process that what seems ordinary can be transformed into revelation. We live in a rhythm where everything is fast, where thoughts come and go all the time, and we often don't give space to understand what really matters. But Mary shows us that there is value in silence, in pause, in meditation. It is in this place that the mind begins to deepen, that the heart begins to discern, that truth begins to form from the inside out. Blessed is man, whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and meditates on his law day and night. Psalm 1:1-2. This does not speak of something mechanical, but of a constant relationship with the truth. Meditating is not repeating meaningless words, it is absorbing. It is allowing it to mold thoughts, direct decisions, transform the way we see life. And when someone develops this practice, something starts to happen naturally. The mind is strengthened, becomes firmer, less influenced by distractions or empty thoughts. It starts to have depth, clarity, direction. And this creates an internal environment where God can speak more freely, because there is space, there is attention, there is a willingness to listen. Maybe you've experienced moments when something happened, but you didn't stop to reflect, you just moved on. And perhaps now you are realizing that some answers did not come because there was no space to meditate, to seek understanding. And this is not an irreversible mistake, it is an invitation to a new position. Because when the mind learns to meditate on what comes from God, it ceases to be just a place of passage of thoughts and becomes a fertile ground, where seeds are planted, grow, and generate direction. And this process, although silent, transforms everything around. Perhaps you have been waiting for an answer for a long time, something that has not yet been clear within you. And it may be that this moment is exactly the beginning of a new understanding. Stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed can bring a clarity that you have not found until now. And after all this, there is a point that many do not consider, but which has a profound impact on thoughts: the state in which the mind is. Because a distorted thought is not always born of rebellion or lack of faith. Sometimes it is born of tiredness. And Elijah's story reveals just that in a surprising way. Elijah had experienced one of the greatest spiritual victories on record, faced intense challenges, saw the power of God manifest clearly. But soon after that, something changed. The physical, emotional, and spiritual exhaustion began to weigh on him, and his mind was no longer seeing reality in the same way. What was once conviction has turned into discouragement. What was once courage has given way to fear. And then he declares something that reveals the level of this exhaustion. Enough. Take now, O Lord, my life. 1 Kings 19:4. This shows that even someone who has experienced the supernatural can reach a point where thoughts become distorted. Not because God has changed, not because the truth has changed, but because one's internal condition has been affected. Tiredness has the power to alter the way the mind interprets everything around it. Problems seem bigger, solutions seem more distant, and hope begins to weaken. And here is something that needs to be understood very clearly. God not only observes thoughts, he also understands the condition that lies behind them. And in Elijah's case, God didn't start by correcting his words or confronting his thoughts. He started by restoring. Get up and eat, for the way will be very long for you. 1 Kings 19:7. Before any direction, before any response, came care. This reveals a profound principle. The mind needs balance to stay aligned with the truth. When the body is exhausted, when emotions are overloaded, when the person is at the limit, thoughts fail to clearly reflect what is real. And God in his wisdom is not ignorant of this. He treats the root before treating the fruit. Elijah needed to rest, he needed to recover, he needed to be strengthened again. And only after that, God began to speak to him more directly. This shows that not every thought needs to be fought immediately. Some need to be understood within the context in which they emerged. Maybe you've been through moments like this, where everything seemed heavy, where negative thoughts came up with more force, where clarity seemed distant. And maybe you judged yourself for it, not realizing that what you needed at that moment was not only to correct the mind, but to restore the heart, the body, the interior as a whole. God does not move away in these moments. He draws near, he cares, he sustains, he strengthens, so that the mind returns to the place of balance. Because a rested mind sees differently, decides differently, responds differently. If this message has reached you now, perhaps it is exactly God's care reaching you at this time. And if you want to continue receiving words like this, which strengthen, align, and bring direction, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and continue walking together on this journey of faith. And when we look at Paul's life, we find one of the strongest examples that the mind need not be a prisoner of circumstances, because while his body was bound by chains, his mind remained free, aligned, grounded in something that went far beyond the surrounding environment. He did not deny reality, he did not ignore the difficulties, but he chose not to allow it to dominate his thoughts. Paul writes words that at first glance seem impossible to someone in the condition he was in. I have learned to be content with what I have, Philippians 4:11. This was not born of ease, it was born of maturity. He learned. This means that there was a process, an internal construct, where your thoughts were being aligned with the truth, regardless of what was happening externally. And here is something that completely changes the perspective. Peace and stability do not depend on the environment. They depend on what governs the mind. Paul could have entertained thoughts of injustice, of revolt, of discouragement. He had reasons for that. But he chose another path. He decided to focus on the purpose, on what God was still doing through him, even in that place. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, Philippians 4:13. This statement was not made in a moment of comfort, but in the midst of limitation. This shows that the strength he mentions does not come from circumstances, it comes from within, from an alignment with God that sustains the mind even when everything around tries to weaken. And this reveals a level of spiritual maturity that few reach, but which is available to all who decide to walk this path. Governing the mind does not mean never having negative thoughts, but it does mean not allowing them to become dominant. It is to recognize what arises, but to consciously choose what remains. Paul was not defined by prison because his mind was not caught in it. He continued writing, teaching, strengthening others, even in a situation that could have interrupted everything. This shows that when the mind is aligned with the truth, it becomes unshakable. Not because circumstances cease to exist, but because they lose the power to control the interior. And perhaps here is something that needs to be observed carefully. Often, the greatest limit is not outside, it is inside. It is not in the situations, but in the way they are interpreted. Because two scenarios can be the same externally, but completely different internally, depending on who is living. God observes just that. He sees when someone chooses to stand firm, when he decides to trust even without understanding, when he maintains hope even in contrary environments. This choice, silent, constant, has a deep spiritual weight. And as you look at Paul, it's clear that the mind, when governed by truth, becomes a place of stability. A place where faith does not fluctuate easily, where peace does not depend on external conditions, where hope remains alive even in the midst of limitations. And this opens up a real possibility to live differently, not because everything around you has changed, but because something inside has been aligned. Because when the mind finds that place, it stops reacting to the environment and starts responding to something much bigger. And at that moment in the sea, everything seemed out of control. The strong wind, the waves rising, the boat being tossed from side to side. And within that scenario, something began to happen first in the disciples' minds, before manifesting itself in their attitudes. Fear took place. It wasn't just a reaction to the environment, it was an internal domain that completely distorted the perception of reality. Because the most important detail of that scene is often overlooked. Jesus was in the boat. His presence never left, but even so, the disciples' thoughts began to build a different narrative, a reality where the danger seemed greater than the presence of God. And this reveals something extremely profound about how the mind can be influenced. When fear takes over, it alters the way everything is seen. It magnifies the problem, reduces hope, and most importantly, makes the person forget what he already knows about God. And that's exactly what happened there. The disciples, who had already seen miracles, who had already walked with Jesus, at that moment acted as if they were alone. "Why are you so timid? Do you not yet have faith?" Mark 4:40. This question was not just a correction. It was a direct confrontation with what was going on inside them. Jesus wasn't just calming the outer storm, he was revealing the inner storm that had taken over their minds. And here's an essential point. Fear doesn't have to be logical to be dominant. It just needs to be fed. Repeated thoughts, focused on the problem, disconnected from the truth, create a sense of reality that doesn't always correspond to what's really happening. And when this is not interrupted, faith loses space. But then something happens that changes everything. Then he got up, and there was a great calm. Mark 4:39. The external storm was calmed with a word. But what needed to be dealt with was deeper. Because even if the environment changed, if the mind continued to be dominated by fear, the next challenge would bring the same reaction. This shows that faith does not eliminate storms, but redefines the way they are faced. It does not deny the problem, but it does not allow it to become greater than the presence of God. And this starts in the mind, in the thought that decides to trust even when everything seems otherwise. Perhaps you have experienced moments like this, where the surrounding scenario seemed to crumble and, little by little, thoughts of fear began to take over. And without realizing it, what you knew about God took a back seat while the problem took center stage. And it is exactly at this point that this message becomes personal, because it shows that God does not ignore this process. He confronts, he reveals, he calls back to the truth, not to condemn, but to align. Few people will understand the depth of this, but if you've made it this far, it's no coincidence. There is something being dealt with within you right now. Keep going, because what is yet to be revealed can completely transform the way you face every storm in your life. And when we look at the early church, we find something that goes beyond miracles and visible manifestations. There is a silent foundation that supported all that, unity of thought. It wasn't just about being together physically, but about being aligned internally. There was a deep agreement, a harmony that began within the mind of each one and was reflected in the collective. And there was one heart and soul of the multitude of them that believed. Acts 4:32. This expression reveals something extremely rare because it speaks of different people with different stories, but who decided to align their thoughts around a single purpose. This does not happen automatically. It requires renunciation, it requires maturity, it requires a constant choice not to allow thoughts of division to gain space. Because just as individual thoughts shape personal destinies, collective thoughts shape spiritual environments. When there is unity, something opens up. The presence of God manifests itself more intensely, the direction becomes clearer, the spiritual force multiplies. But when there is division, even if silent, something is weakened. They all persevered with one accord, Acts 1:14. This shows that it was not just a moment, it was an ongoing practice. They remained aligned, insisted on unity, protected what they were building together, and this reveals a principle that is often ignored. God observes not only the individual heart, but also the collective environment formed by the thoughts of a group. True unity is not superficial. It does not depend only on words or external appearance. It starts from the inside, in the way each person decides to think, interpret, react. Thoughts of judgment, envy, comparison, or pride may seem small, but when present, they begin to silently break that harmony. On the other hand, when thoughts are aligned with love, purpose, and truth, something powerful happens. The atmosphere becomes light, faith is strengthened, the presence of God becomes perceptible. And this is no coincidence, it is the result of an internal alignment that is reflected externally. The early church was not perfect, but it was united. And this unity created a space where God acted in an evident way. Miracles happened, lives were transformed, because there was agreement not only in actions, but in thoughts. And perhaps here there is a very important reflection. How are the thoughts within the environments you are part of? Is there unity or division? Is there alignment or internal conflict? Because it doesn't just affect you, it affects everything around you. God doesn't just see isolated individuals, He looks at the whole. He notices when there is harmony, when there is sincere intention to walk together, when there is a collective effort to keep the mind aligned with the truth. And when this happens, the result goes beyond the natural. Because unity is not just a human condition, it is a spiritual channel, a place where that which is invisible begins to manifest itself in a real way, where the sky finds space to act through hearts that have decided to think, feel, and walk in the same direction. And when it comes to the book of Revelation, this whole journey takes on an even deeper weight, because that which has been built in silence within the heart will finally be revealed without any barrier. There will be no more room for appearance, nor for justifications, nor for hiding what has never been exposed. All that has been thought, felt, and cultivated within will be brought to light with absolute clarity. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books, according to their works. Revelation 20:12. But when the Bible speaks of works, it is not limited to what has been done externally. The works are the result of something deeper. They are born from the thoughts, intentions, motivations that have been nurtured throughout life. This means that the final judgment will not be superficial, it will be complete. And perhaps here is one of the most impactful truths of all. Nothing will remain hidden. What no one saw, what was never said, what was kept inside, everything will be revealed. Not to expose for exposition's sake, but because God is truth, and before Him everything needs to be fully aligned with that truth. Behold, I come quickly to give to each one according to his work. Revelation 22:12. This statement carries urgency. It is not something distant. It is not just symbolic. It is a reality that points to the fact that each thought has value, each intention has weight, each internal decision builds something eternal. And this completely changes the way we see our own life. Because it's not just about avoiding visible mistakes, but about taking care of what's being built inside the heart every day. Thoughts are not disposable. They are seeds, and each seed planted sooner or later produces fruit. God's judgment is perfect precisely because he sees what no one else sees. He is not influenced by appearance, he is not deceived by speeches, he is not confused by external attitudes that do not correspond to the interior. He sees the root, and it is the root that defines the fruit. And while this may seem intense, it also reveals something fair, because no one will be evaluated superficially. Each person will be seen exactly as they are, with total truth. And this brings a responsibility, but also an opportunity, because what is being dealt with now, what is being adjusted, what is being transformed within you, all of this has eternal value. Perhaps you have never stopped to think that your thoughts have this level of importance, that what happens inside you is so relevant before God. But that's exactly what's being revealed here. Eternity will not be defined only by what has been seen, but by what has been experienced internally. And at this moment, as you reflect on all of this, it may be that a deeper awareness is emerging, a different perception about your own life, about your thoughts, about what needs to be aligned. And this is not by chance. If this message is bringing answers you needed to hear, don't let it pass. Write in the comments, "I trust in God's action," and allow that truth to begin to take hold within you in a real way. And when Jeremiah declares something so direct and perplexing about the human heart, he completely breaks with a very common idea, that we can fully trust what we feel or think without question. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who will know him? Jeremiah 17:9. This statement is not just a warning, it is an invitation to vigilance, because it reveals that the greatest risk is not only in external influences, but in what is born within us, and that often seems right at first glance. The heart can justify, it can soften, it can even create convincing arguments to support thoughts that are actually misaligned with God's truth. And the most dangerous thing is that this happens in a subtle way. They are not always clearly wrong thoughts. They are often ideas that seem reasonable, decisions that seem balanced, paths that seem safe. But without confrontation with the truth, they can carry deep distortions. And it is exactly here that God's judgment is completely different from human perception. While the human being evaluates based on what he feels or understands, God sees what is behind, what motivates, what drives. I, the Lord, search the heart. Jeremiah 17:10. This means that there is no room for self-deception before him. That which may seem right to you may be completely distorted in the light of divine truth. And this is not to generate fear, but awareness, because recognizing that the heart can deceive is the first step to seeking direction outside of yourself. It is understanding that not every thought should be automatically accepted, that not every sensation should be followed, that not every decision should be made solely based on what feels right at the moment. Spiritual vigilance is born exactly from this understanding. It is a constant posture of observing, questioning, submitting thoughts to God's truth. It is not trusting only one's own perception, but seeking alignment with something bigger, more stable, more true. Because without this, the mind becomes vulnerable to constructing paths based on illusions that seem real. And maybe you've experienced it at some point when something felt right, but then it revealed consequences you didn't expect. This happens because the heart does not always show everything clearly. He can hide intentions, mask desires, distort priorities. And without discernment, the person follows a path believing that he is safe, when in fact he is being guided by something that has not been confronted. Therefore, depending only on oneself is not enough. It is necessary to allow God to reveal, to enlighten, to show what is hidden. Because only he sees with total clarity. He alone sees that which even you cannot fully perceive. And when that awareness becomes part of life, something starts to change. The person starts to be more careful, more attentive, more sensitive. He stops blindly trusting himself and begins to seek constant alignment with the truth. Because he understands that the heart can deceive, but God never makes a mistake in revealing. And when Jesus tells this parable, he's not just narrating an ordinary scene, he's revealing one of the most profound contrasts in how God views the human heart. Two men go up to the temple to pray. Externally, both are in the right place, doing something seemingly right, but internally, they are in completely opposite positions. The Pharisee begins his prayer with words that seem spiritual, but carry something hidden within them. He is grateful, but not because he recognizes God's grace, but because he considers himself better than others. Your thoughts are full of comparison, of self-sufficiency, of a sense of superiority that puts you above those around you. He does not realize it, but his prayer is not a connection with God. It is an affirmation of himself. Meanwhile, the publican remains at a distance. He does not raise his eyes, does not try to impress, does not construct an elaborate discourse. All that he carries is within, and this content overflows in a few words. O God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Luke 18:13. There is no justification, there is no comparison, there is no defense. Just recognition. And it is exactly at this point that God's judgment is clearly manifested, because God does not respond to the appearance of prayer, but to the intention that sustains it. The Pharisee seemed right, but his heart was closed. The publican looked weak, but his heart was open. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled. Luke 18:14. This truth exposes something that often goes unnoticed. Thoughts of spiritual pride are extremely dangerous because they create an illusion of closeness to God when in fact they drive away. They prevent the recognition of one's own need, block humility, and close the space where grace could act. On the other hand, thoughts of humility have a completely different effect. They do not diminish a person, they position him correctly before God. They open doors, they create access, they allow grace to reach exactly where it is needed. The publican had no appearance, but he had truth. And that was enough. And here is one of the most important revelations of this journey. God is not looking for external perfection, he is observing the internal condition. It's not what you show, it's what you carry. It's not what you say, it's what's behind what you say. Perhaps at times you have already compared yourself with others. You have already measured your spirituality based on external references. You have already thought that you were in a safe position just for what you did. And this parable completely breaks this logic because it shows that everything begins within. The Pharisee left the same way he entered because he saw no need for change. The tax collector went out justified because he recognized who he really was before God. And this difference was not in the actions, it was in the thoughts. This reveals that a humble heart always finds favor, not because it's perfect, but because it's open. And when there is openness, God enters, transforms, restores. Because in the end, what defines everything is not what others see, but what God finds within you. And when God calls Moses, what is revealed is not only a powerful encounter, but a direct confrontation with what was inside his mind. Because before any step, before any miracle, before any leadership, thoughts arise that try to limit what God had already determined. Moses did not respond with immediate promptness. He responded with internal resistance. Our Lord, I was never eloquent, Exodus 4:10. This line is not just an excuse, it is a window into his heart. Moses was looking at himself, at his limitations, at what he believed he didn't have. And this reveals something very common. When God calls, the human mind often responds with what is lacking, not with what can be done through him. And this is one of the most delicate points of this journey. Because thoughts of limitation do not seem rebellious at first glance. They seem like humility, they seem like prudence, they even seem like realism. But in fact, they can become silent barriers that prevent advancement. Moses was not denying God directly, but he was putting his own perceptions above what God was saying. And then God responds in a way that completely breaks that pattern. Who made the mouth of man? Is it not I, the Lord? Exodus 4:11. This response is not just a correction, it is a redefinition of perspective. God takes Moses' focus away from himself and puts it in the right place, on him. Because the call was never based on human ability, but on divine ability. This reveals something profound about how God judges the thoughts of the heart. He does not only observe the fear or insecurity, but the decision that comes after that. When someone gets caught up in limiting thoughts, they begin to resist the purpose without even realizing it. And this resistance is not in visible actions, but in what is fed internally. Moises had to go through this process of confrontation. He needed to leave a place where his limitations defined his decisions and enter a place where trust in God began to guide his steps. And this didn't happen instantly. It was a process where every thought needed to be aligned, adjusted, transformed, and perhaps this is a very personal point for those who are listening right now, because how many times have thoughts of inadequacy arisen? How many times has something been interrupted before it even started, just because the mind has built arguments against it? And the deepest thing is to realize that many times this happens so naturally that it is not even questioned. But when God calls, he already considers what he himself is going to do. He doesn't just look at what you are today, but at what you can become through him. And when those thoughts start to be replaced, something changes. What once seemed impossible begins to become a path. What once seemed distant begins to approach. Transformation begins exactly at this point, when the mind stops relying on its own limitations and starts trusting in what God can accomplish. And this change, although internal, completely redefines what happens externally. In the next few moments, something even deeper will be revealed, something that can directly touch areas that you may never have clearly observed. Be aware, because this can be more than a message, it can be a direct sign from God to you. And in the midst of the story of the prodigal son, there is a moment that changes everything, but that does not happen externally. There is no applause, there are no witnesses, there are no visible signs. It is a silent internal instant, almost imperceptible to those who observe from the outside, but completely decisive for their destiny. The Bible describes this simply but profoundly. He came to his senses and said, Luke 15:17, "This is the turning point." Because until that moment, he was living the consequences of his choices, experiencing scarcity, emptiness, distance. But the real problem didn't start when he lost everything. It started when his thoughts took him away. And now, in the same way, change doesn't begin when he physically stands up. It begins when something inside of him aligns again with the truth. Falling to your senses reveals an awakening. It's as if, for a moment, he could see beyond the situation he was in. He realizes reality, recognizes where he has arrived, understands what he has lost. And this did not come from outside, it came from within. It was a thought that broke the illusion, that brought clarity, that opened the eyes of your mind. And that's one of the most powerful points about how God judges the thoughts of the heart. Because before any action, before any step back, God already sees that moment. He observes when someone decides internally to change, when the mind stops justifying and starts recognizing, when the heart stops resisting and begins to surrender. I will arise and go to my Father. Luke 15:18. This decision was born before the movement. The return began in the mind, in the choice to no longer remain where I was. And this shows that true repentance does not begin with words or gestures, it begins with transformed thinking. The prodigal son was still in the same place, in the same condition, surrounded by the same circumstances, but something had already changed completely. And when that happens, the path also changes. Because that which is decided within inevitably manifests itself without. And perhaps the most impactful thing about this story is understanding that God values this moment. He doesn't just wait for the arrival, he responds to the inner movement. He sees when someone, even though he is still far away, decides to come back. And this recognition already begins to move something in the spiritual world. How many people remain imprisoned not because they cannot get out, but because they have not yet decided within themselves? How many continue in the same cycle because the thoughts have not yet been confronted? Because while the mind does not change, the path does not change either. But when that awakening happens, everything starts to line up. The vision changes, the direction changes, the disposition changes. And what once seemed impossible begins to become one step at a time. The prodigal son shows us that no matter how far someone has gone, there is always a point of return. And that point is not in a physical place, it's inside. It is the moment when the mind recognizes, the heart opens, and a silent decision redefines everything. And it is exactly at this moment that God begins to act, not only waiting for the arrival, but responding to the transformation that began where no one else could see, but where he had always been looking. And when God speaks to Joshua at the beginning of his journey, he doesn't just deliver a mission, he reveals a key. It is not a military strategy, it is not a detailed plan of external conquests, it is something much deeper and quieter, the way Joshua was to govern his own mind. Because before leading a people, before facing challenges, before making decisions that would change destinies, he needed to align his thoughts. Let not the book of this law depart from thy mouth, but meditate on it day and night. Joshua 1:8. This instruction is not accidental, it is central. God is showing that direction does not come from impulses, nor from momentary reactions, but from a mind constantly connected with the truth. Meditating here is not just reading or repeating, it is absorbing. It is allowing the word to shape the way we think, interpret, and decide. And this reveals something essential. External decisions are a reflection of internal thoughts. When the mind is misaligned, choices become unstable. When it is connected with the truth, there is clarity. And this clarity does not depend on perfect circumstances. It is born from an interior that has been disciplined over time. Joshua was faced with enormous challenges, responsibilities that could easily generate fear, doubt, or confusion. But God didn't tell him to focus on the size of the problem. He told him to focus on what would sustain his mind. Because a properly fed mind responds differently, sees differently, stands firm where others would falter. Then shalt thou prosper thy way. Joshua 1:8. This shows that spiritual prosperity is not random. It does not happen by chance. It is the consequence of an internal process. When thoughts are aligned with the word, the path begins to adjust. It does not mean the absence of challenges, but the presence of leadership in the midst of them. And here's a point that many overlook. God guides through an aligned mind. He does not force decisions, he illuminates paths. But to perceive this direction, it is necessary to be sensitive, attentive, connected. And this sensitivity does not come suddenly. It is built on the daily discipline of keeping the mind in the right place. Maybe you've faced moments when you didn't know what decision to make, paths that seemed confusing, situations where clarity was lacking. And often the answer is not outside, it is in the way the mind is being fed. because when thoughts are scattered, the direction seems distant. But when they are aligned, something begins to organize internally. Joshua received a promise, but he also received a condition. And this condition was not linked to external effort, but to internal constancy. Meditate, stay, align. This creates an environment where God can lead with precision. And when you understand this, everything changes, because direction is no longer something uncertain and becomes a natural flow of a mind that has been trained in truth. And when this alignment becomes continuous, the path stops being guided by chance and starts to be led by something much bigger, something that starts within, but transforms everything around. And in the midst of a crowd that followed Jesus, there was a man who could not see, but could perceive something that many seeing did not. Bartimaeus was on the side of the road in a position that, for many, represented limitation, exclusion, silence. But inside him, something began to form differently. It was not just an impulse, it was a thought of faith that rose above anything he had ever experienced. When he heard that Jesus was passing by, that moment activated something internal. He might have thought that he was not worthy, that he would not be heard, that his condition prevented him. But instead, he chose another direction. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Mark 10:47. This cry was not born only of despair, it was born of a conviction. He recognized who Jesus was, and that completely changed the way he reacted. And then something happened that reveals one of the mind's greatest challenges. Outside voices began to try to silence him. People around him scolded him, told him to shut up, as if it wasn't the time, as if he had no right to insist. And this is exactly the point where many retreat. Not because of a lack of initial faith, but because they allow outside voices to influence their inner thoughts. But Bartimaeus did something different. He didn't just ignore it, he stepped it up. The Bible says that he cried out even louder. This shows that within him there was already a decision made. He would not allow anything to interrupt that moment. And this reveals a powerful principle. Thoughts of faith need to be protected because there will always be something trying to stifle them. Bartimaeus' mind was not dominated by rejection, nor by the opinion of others, nor by the position he was in. It was sustained by a conviction that surpassed all this, and it is exactly this internal posture that draws Jesus' attention. Go, your faith has made you whole. Mark 10:52. Jesus did not respond only to the cry, but to the faith that sustained that cry. He saw the internal decision not to back down, not to be silent, not to give up. And this shows that God responds when someone decides to stand firm inside, even when everything around them says otherwise. Bartimaeus broke through a barrier that was not only physical, it was mental. He overcame that which could have kept him in the same place forever. And when that barrier was broken, the miracle became accessible. Maybe there are voices around you, situations, memories, or even internal thoughts trying to make you retreat, make you believe that it is not the time, that it is not possible, that it is not for you. But this story reveals that faith does not depend on external approval. It depends on the internal decision to continue. And when that decision is upheld, something starts to move. Because the mind determined by faith does not accept to remain limited. It advances, insists, remains, until what seemed distant becomes real. By the end of this video, you'll feel God's presence in a way that you may never have experienced before. Stay, because what is yet to come can touch something very deep within you. And when Paul writes to Timothy, there is a tone that goes beyond simple guidance. It is almost as if he was trying to awaken something that was already inside him, but that needed to be strengthened. Because Timothy had a calling, he had purpose, he had direction, but there was something silent trying to limit all of that, thoughts of fear, of insecurity, of self-doubt. And Paul is not ignorant of this. He does not treat it as something small, nor as something irrelevant. He directly confronts the root. For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. 2 Timothy 1:7. This statement completely changes the perspective because it shows that fear does not come from God. That is, when the mind begins to be dominated by this type of thinking, it is being influenced by something that is not aligned with divine truth. And this is extremely important because many accept fear as something natural, as an inevitable part of the process. But here it is being revealed that he needs to be confronted, not ignored, not fed, but replaced. Because in his place, God has already made something different available: power to act, love to stand firm, and moderation to maintain balance, even under pressure. Timothy needed to understand that his thoughts could not be guided by insecurity. Because thoughts like this don't just bother, they limit. They make the person retreat, postpone, doubt what has already been placed inside him. And when this is not addressed, the call begins to be stifled even before it fully manifests. Fight the good fight of faith. 1 Timothy 6:12. This reveals that there is a struggle, but not only an external one. It is an internal battle where the mind needs to decide daily which voice it will follow. Fear speaks, doubt insists, insecurity tries to gain space. But faith also speaks. And victory begins exactly at the moment when the mind chooses which of these voices will remain. And maybe you felt it in a very real way, that moment when something inside you tells you to move forward, but at the same time a thought comes up trying to make you step back. This conflict is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign that there is something important at stake. And it is exactly at this point that the decision needs to be made, because God observes this. He sees when someone faces fear from within, when they decide not to give up, when they choose to continue even without all the guarantees. This choice, invisible to many, has a profound spiritual value. Timothy didn't need to become someone else. He needed to align his mind with what God had already placed inside him. And when that happens, something changes. Fear loses strength, courage begins to grow, and what once seemed impossible begins to become a possible step. Nothing in this life happens without a purpose. And if that word has come to you now, perhaps it is precisely because there is something within you that needs to be strengthened at this time. If you feel this, write in the comments, "I believe, Lord," and allow that truth to begin to take hold within you even more strongly. Everything that has been revealed so far points to an inescapable truth. It is not just circumstances that need to change, it is the interior that needs to align. Because as long as thoughts remain misaligned, life continues to go in the same direction, even when there is a desire for change. And that is exactly why this moment becomes so important, because it is no longer about understanding, but about responding. What was exposed was not to generate weight, but to open a path of return, of adjustment, of alignment with what God sees and knows in depth. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. James 4:8. This promise is not distant, it is immediate. It reveals that when someone takes a step toward God, even if it's internal, even if it's silent, he responds. And perhaps this is the time to do just that. To stop for a moment and look within, to recognize what needs to be transformed, to allow the truth to go beyond the mind and reach the heart. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Psalm 139:23. This is the prayer that opens doors, not a prayer based on appearance, but on surrender. Because only when there is a willingness to be probed does the transformation really begin. Now is the time to stand before God, without masks, without justifications, just with an open heart, ready to be aligned with the truth that sets you free. Beloved Father, your word reminds us that nothing is hidden from you and that you deeply know every thought and intent of the heart. At this moment, this truth does not bring fear but hope, because we know that we are before a God who not only sees but also restores, transforms, and leads with perfect love. Lord, we thank you for every teaching revealed so far, for every truth that has brought light to our thoughts, and for every moment when we feel your presence leading us to a deeper place. Thank you that you do not leave us in superficiality, but call us to a true relationship where the interior is dealt with and aligned with your will. Father, at this moment, there is a sincere cry for transformation. It gives us the strength to face what needs to be confronted within us. Give us wisdom to discern thoughts that do not come from you and courage to replace them with your truth. Teach us to live with a mind that is aligned, steadfast, sensitive to your voice, and resistant to everything that tries to take us away from your purpose. Lord, reach out now to those who are emotionally tired, to those whose thoughts have been a constant battleground. It brings peace where there is anxiety, clarity where there is confusion, hope where there is discouragement. It also touches the deepest areas, families in need of restoration, hearts that carry wounds, lives that face financial difficulties or illness. May your power manifest in a real way, bringing healing, provision, and renewal. In this instant, in silence, each heart opens before you. Every request, every pain, every need is placed at your feet. You know everything, Lord, even that which has not been spoken in words. Father, we have received your care and completely surrendered our thoughts, our fears, our dreams, and our decisions. May nothing within us remain out of line with your will. We trust that you are in control of all things and that your plan is perfect, even when we don't fully understand it. May your word become alive within us. May our minds be renewed, and may the peace that surpasses all understanding guard our hearts and our thoughts in Christ Jesus, as it is written in Philippians 4:7. And that each day we can live closer to you, reflecting your truth in everything. If this prayer represents what is in your heart right now, write Amen and surrender it to God as an act of faith. We pray confidently in the name of Jesus. Amen. Throughout all that has been revealed, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. God is not only looking at what you do, but at what you think, feel, and cultivate within your heart. Every story, every teaching, every confrontation has shown that thoughts are not neutral. They build destinies, bring them closer or farther away, strengthen or weaken their spiritual life. And maybe now you realize that this message was not just another content, this message is for you. There's a reason you've come this far, because God has chosen you to hear this today. He is calling you to a deeper level where it is not enough to appear. It is necessary to be transformed from the inside out. And the question that remains now is simple but powerful. What thoughts will you continue to feed from today? I am very happy to know that we are together on this journey, because this is not just a video. It is an encounter scheduled by God. You are part of it, and your presence here has value. If this message spoke to you, don't let it pass you by in silence. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell to continue receiving these words that strengthen faith. And I want to meet you too. I want to know about you. Comment below where you're watching, and if you feel in your heart, share a little bit of your story or something you're going through. We are creating a chain of faith here, and your life matters, your story matters, and together we can pray and strengthen each other. But understand something very important. This does not end here. There is a next step, something even deeper that you need to access. In the next video, we will advance this journey and reveal how to live practically with a mind aligned with God every day, facing internal battles and winning with spiritual authority. It's not just theory, it's real transformation. And if you've made it this far, it's because you're ready to go further. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater than any attack. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and I'll wait for you in the next video.